Welcome here. We're exactly 12 months before the general election, or some of us like to think 14 months before the Ashes battle is resumed. And we decided exactly on this day to launch two reports, which we're going to be discussing this morning. The first is on Year 5, which Akash Paun and Robin Munro have done, and the second which Catherine Haddon's done, which is on pre-election contacts. Now, the interesting point is Kath and I were very much involved before the election, with considerable help from two other speakers I'll introduce in a moment, in looking at work on what we then call transitions. And both before the election, we produced a report in November 2009, and then 2 years later, lessons learnt. But what's interesting this time is not only are those issues very valid and lively, but the existence of the coalition has presented a whole series of new challenges about what should happen in the run-up to the election, of the question about how the civil service should relate to having two parties in departments, or in departments where there is only one lot of ministers. How should the relationship work? That it isn't, given the conventions on civil service advice, what happens when, in practice, a party is seeking analysis, costings, etc., on an area where it doesn't want the other party to know about. We've already seen some tensions emerging, notably over the knife crime issue even in the last week, and we expect those tensions to increase. So what we look at in what Akash looks at in the report is how could some of those tensions be overcome to ensure there is effective government in the run-up to the election. We've looked a lot at experience overseas. We had an event here last November, a very good event, on the ends of coalitions, but also looking more positively at what happens in the last year. We published a series of briefing papers, which are on the website, looking at experience in other countries. Other countries, of course, now include Scotland, and we have the foremost expert on how to handle coalitions, end of coalitions in Scotland, in Sir John Elvidge, who is very close to us at the Institute, and has produced some very interesting work, again, on our website. So I'm very glad to welcome you back, John. And the foremost outside Whitehall expert on transitions in Sir Alex Allan, both from his experience in 1997 as Principal Private Secretary in Downing Street, seeing the Major to Blair transition, and also in his final period in Whitehall, in the Cabinet Office, where he did much of the coordination work with Gus O'Donnell at the last election. So we've got the two experts in their area. Now, the order is going to be, Akash is going to talk briefly about his report, and Catherine's going to talk about her report. Then we're going to get the Scottish experience from John, then the perspective from Alex. So over to you, Akash.
Well, thanks, Peter, and well, thanks to all of you for joining us on this morning of the first day of the 5th year of the UK Coalition. And I mean, before we talk about any of the issues that may arise over the coming 12 months, I think it is first worth just recognising that simply having got this far is a commendable achievement in itself. I mean, back in 2010, there were lots of people, of course, who doubted the viability and the longevity of the coalition, and I generally think it's to the credit of both the parties and the civil service that the past 4 years have shown that coalition government can work in the United Kingdom. We all know that the opinion polls and, probably more importantly, the longer-term electoral trends show that further hung parliaments and coalitions are fairly likely over the coming electoral cycles. So, you know, lessons from this time will no doubt help guide experience in the future. But all that being said, we do think, and we do feel our research has shown, that there are a number of important challenges arising already and likely to become more serious over the coming months that serious thought needs to be put into. We've been working for 9 months or so on this project. We've explored international lessons from various places, including from Scotland, where the experience we found was actually a very useful model in many respects. And we've spoken to 30 or so senior figures, mainly senior civil servants, some people on the political side too, across Whitehall, pretty wide range of departments. You've got the summary of the report in front of you. The full report has plenty of evidence from those interviews, anonymised quotes and so on. And I mean, what we heard in sum was the following. Well, first of all, of course, in a normal context of a single-party government, the pre-election period will often see civil servants called upon by ministers to indirectly, of course, help to develop policy that then feeds into the manifesto. That's sort of recognised as what happens and often seen as fairly sensible. As one person put it to us, it's incredibly easy. You just have to ask the right questions, because it's always your right as a minister to request advice from the civil service. So there's no suggestion that anything improper goes on, but simply that if a minister a few months before an election asks for policy options to be developed in some area, they might then, of course, take the work of the civil service away and use to inform the party's manifesto development process. That's what happens. But, of course, the context of coalition makes this a lot more complicated. What rights do the parties have to use the civil service to help develop policy that is just for their party? Or to turn that around, what should civil servants do? How should they respond if asked by ministers to develop policy ideas just for one side of the coalition, particularly if they're being asked at the same time not under any circumstances to reveal what they're doing to the other side of the coalition. And this is not a hypothetical concern. I mean, we encountered in various places across the government evidence that this had already happened. And what we also found in our interviews was that there's quite a degree of inconsistency in how departments or particular parts of departments respond to that unfamiliar challenge. And it is an unfamiliar position for officials and for government to be in. So there wasn't also a shared agreement or sense of understanding about what the right approach to take in that situation was. And consequently, yes, we did find variation. In some places, we were told that there was a sort of genuine culture of openness within departments and within ministerial teams, policy submissions sort of, as a matter of course, copied to both sides. Sometimes even this was copied to advisors outside the department in some of the departments where there were no ministers from the Liberal Democrats. In other places, though, it didn't work quite in that way. In some places we were told of parallel channels of advice already having been created, often in quite ad hoc ways, just in response to short-term pressures. And sometimes, yes, with this requirement that things should be done in private. And there are a number of quotes illustrating that in our report. One person said to us, for example, we're often providing things for one or the other minister without copying in the other sides, and that's quite an uncomfortable place for us to be. But that's just one of a number of quotes. There's also been particular challenges around issue I mentioned in passing, Liberal Democrat access to those departments where they have limited or obviously in a number of cases no ministerial representation at all. We know that's been an issue from the start. Additional special advisors were of course appointed in 2011 or so to be given access to departments with no Liberal Democrat representation or just a junior minister, and we know that the picture's been quite varied in how that's worked. But it's not just a one-way thing, and that we heard cases where it was more the other way around as well. So this is something that affects both parties. So that's something that has been happening over the past couple of years in particular, probably. But of course, what becomes especially difficult in the final year is when we are really in manifesto development phase or thinking about the next term. As one official put it to us, the difficulty is when officials are asked to work up ideas where it is completely implausible that these might be pursued as part of a collective agreed plan and were in fact intended as the expression of a single party's views or to contribute to a single party's manifesto. So that's the concern we heard. And in terms of how government or how the civil service might respond to that, we heard, again, quite different ideas. I mean, one risk we heard was that when placed in this position, there might be a retreat away from engaging in policy work and future thinking beyond the election in difficult contested areas. So one person we spoke to expressed a concern about planning blight in their area, where people don't push out into more difficult, controversial territory. Another worried that government might grind ourselves to a halt by our own paranoia. So these are some of the perspectives we heard, and the conclusion was, there's also a risk then of parties reaching the election and perhaps then entering into coalition negotiations with policy that hasn't been well thought through and tested, but then might be embedded into a coalition agreement nonetheless. The counter risk is that if officials do what I think often probably comes naturally, respond to what they're asked by ministers, particularly when it's from the Secretary of State, do things that's just in private for one side of the coalition without telling the other side, that there's a risk there of giving rise to a perception of politicisation. I mean, one person said to us, can you imagine what the reputation of the civil service would look like if you have Liberal Democrats saying these rules were set in place and the civil service failed? There's a real risk of perception of political bias, even if advertent, which would not be good for the civil service. And there have also already been cases of announcements, and even in the case of the go-home vans, famously from the Home Office, being announced or rolled out even without coalition agreement. So these kind of episodes, we were told, run the risk of undermining trust and relationships between the two sides, potentially undermining the effectiveness of government in this obviously more politically charged period. So those are some of the concerns we heard. And through many of our conversations in Whitehall, what we heard was a desire for clearer guidance from the centre. What should we do if parties are talking about post-2015 policy, and if they want us to do work on that? Another person said there'd have to be something worked up centrally. You couldn't have different departments taking different approaches, though that is, as I said, what we heard had been happening so far. So that was in summary, the range of concerns that we picked up on across Whitehall. And what we've tried to do in our report is set out some common sense recommendations, as I said, learning from the Scottish experience in particular, but looking elsewhere about how government should respond. The recommendations are set out in detail in the summary that you've got in front of me. I'm running over time, so I won't go over all of them in detail, but in a nutshell, what we advocate is that there should be clear and explicit agreement about the rules of the game for the final period, reached at the top between the political leaders, facilitated at the very top of the civil service by the Cabinet Secretary, and that make clear that the two parties should be able to use civil service support, should have access to all parts of the system to help develop their policy thinking, but that needs to be treated in a different way and kept separate from the ongoing provision of advice and full support to ministers as part of the government of the day. The system needs to be coordinated from the centre, but of course it will be run largely through departments where the policy expertise lies. Permanent secretaries would therefore be held responsible in the way they are also responsible for facilitating contact with the opposition, for ensuring that the system operates fairly, and for ensuring that sufficient work is done on thinking about post-2015 policy challenges. So that's what we suggest for the coalition. We also then do go on to say, in the longer term, we think there is a good case actually for thinking in a more integrated fashion about providing support for policy thinking across the policy spectrum for the opposition parties as well. There's been talk, of course, about things like extending the remit of the OBR, Here we wonder whether simply the scope for pre-election contacts, which Kath will talk about in detail in a moment, might be broadened out to cover issues such as the implementability of policy ideas and to allow for a bit more two-way dialogue between Whitehall and the opposition parties. And I will leave it there and hand over to Kath.
Thanks. Thanks very much indeed, Akash. Lots of questions there to be pursued later on. Thank you. Kath.
Thank you. As Peter and Akash have both touched upon, we're entering into a great period of uncertainty. The 2015 election is, as the polls currently tell us, are going to be one of the sort of least predictable that we've experienced in recent history. As such, the preparation that goes on within the civil service, but also in the parties themselves, to think what they might actually do in government is going to be of huge importance. As Akash has touched upon, the civil service serve the government of the day. But because we have this very unusual internationally system of an almost immediate handover, taking aside the sort of 5 days we went through last time round, you have a case where the civil service have to almost immediately switch their thinking, switch their adjustment, and get to know and start to implement almost from day one the policies of a new government, if a new government it should be. The other thing about 2015 is that what's likely to happen next time round is that we'll have a new government, even if it's a returned government. Even the same parties coming back, or one of the same parties coming back, will likely be a change for those in government. So as such, the preparations that the civil service go through in thinking about how they would adjust to that first day are really important. Now, as I say, they have to do this while serving the government of the day, and that's their ultimate priority. So the activity that goes on in terms of preparing, thinking about what you might do in the event of a change of government, or as I say, in the event of a returned government, has to be done in a limited fashion and kept almost separate from the wider work of continuing to serve the government of the day and continuing to implement right up to that PERDA period. Pre-election contacts are a part of that mechanism, and they're, again, a part of the mechanism that is somewhat evolved because we have this quite unusual system of an almost overnight handover of government. And they've evolved out of a precedent that was set 50 years ago where the then Prime Minister Alec Douglas-Home, allowed the Labour opposition to have more formal contact meetings with senior civil servants because it had come to their attention that Labour opposition would try to do so anyway, because they had this huge plan in place to create a Department for Economic Affairs, the story of which is, would take us up a whole nother seminar. Now, in order to think through what these major changes would involve and all the rest of it, it was deemed that it was worthwhile to allow the opposition to have a series of relatively limited but highly valuable, it was believed at the time, meetings with the senior civil servants so they could lay out what these plans would be and so the civil service could start to think, okay, well, how the hell are we going to do that? Now, because of that precedent, because of the language that went on in the correspondence in setting out what the rules and the parameters would be, that's laid down the basis for the ones we have today. They've become more formalised, they've become more expected as usual sort of proposition and expectation, but they still carry that sort of grey area of, firstly, they are at the call of the Prime Minister and at his discretion, or his or her discretion. And so in that sense, they are, although expected and although normalised, they're still not quite the sort of formal process that might allow all sides to expect what would be involved with them, that they would happen over a clearly set out and uncontestable sort of time period. And this ambiguity between the precedent and the sort of historical evolution and what we might now sit down and design, should we be thinking through, well, what is the best way to do this kind of mechanism, is one of the areas that we've tried to look at in this report. As I say, what we tried to do with this report was both go back over the history of how these these pre-election contacts have developed, but also look particularly at 2010 and what went on there. And for one very good reason, which is, although only at the moment 4 years ago, the sort of learning of the last election. You've also seen quite a reasonable turnover of people who were involved with it last time round. From the permanent secretary side, there's only one remaining permanent secretary still in the same post, although there's others who had good experience of it last time round. And from the opposition's point of view, there are a number of new shadows who won't have had experience of this. But we also felt it was a good time to actually sit down and sort of try and look across the board of these contacts, because they all happen in isolation for each other. We talk a bit in the report about the role that the Cabinet Office and also the party HQs might play or did play in terms of coordinating, thinking about how these conversations happen across the board and thinking about how joined up they are. But it's clear that that's very difficult to do in our current system, which is quite siloed, quite federalised, where the Cabinet Office's role is often a coordinating role, and where the shadows themselves will often be not only conveying what their manifesto policies are, but also often coming in with their own personal agenda and their own personal way of thinking. So the conversations have therefore to be quite confidential between permanent secretary and individual shadow, but nonetheless, when we actually go into how these translate into government policy and implementation of policy, there's a question there about how coordinated they are, how much cross-cutting there can be. And therefore, when a new government gets going, or as I say, a return government, how joined up they are and how much that's reflected in the pre-election contacts. It's probably worth reading out to you what the actual guidance says on this. As I say, it's become somewhat more formalised, but it consists at the moment of 3 paragraphs in the Cabinet Manual, 3 quite short paragraphs. It says, at an appropriate time towards the end of any Parliament, as the next general election approaches, the Prime Minister writes to the leaders of the main opposition parties to authorise pre-election contacts with the civil service. Now, at the moment, as we understand it, David Cameron has written to the leader of the opposition, Ed Miliband, to say that these contacts will begin in October after the party conference season. It then goes on to say, the meetings take place on a confidential basis without ministers being present or receiving a report of the discussions. This makes it different from any other contact that senior civil servants might have with members of the opposition, in as much as though the Secretary of State will know that they're going on, they might not know they won't know the when and where of them, and they obviously won't be privy to the details of them. The Cabinet Secretary has overall responsibility for coordinating this process once a request has been made and authorised by the Prime Minister. These discussions are designed to allow the opposition's shadow ministers to ask questions about departmental organisation and to inform civil servants of any organisational changes likely to take place in the event of a change of government. Senior civil servants may ask questions about the implication of opposition parties' policy statements, although they would not normally comment on or give advice about policies. Now, it's that last sentence that's sort of crucial for what these contacts are about and where the ambiguity has to exist in terms of laying out the guidance of what the contact should be about, but also where it can be a little bit problematic. It's most important that this isn't a policy resource for an opposition party. This is about hearing what they may have as ideas and plans for government, and we talk in the report about how important it is if a shadow team or shadow minister are coming in to have clear ideas about what it is that they do actually want to do, or clear priorities, a limited number that the civil service can then focus on. As we have talked in previous reports about the importance of a new government, or say again, return government, coming in with a clear agenda of a limited number of things that it wants to do. But though they can't therefore give this policy advice, where difficulty we found had arisen in 2010 was this issue about how much you can sort of push back on what you're actually hearing. We talked to a number of senior former civil servants and some current and as well politicians, talking about what the actual content of the discussion was, and hearing about how in practice these dividing lines are a little bit more fuzzy between, okay, so you're hearing about so-and-so's got an particular act they want to be enacted very early on in the government, but you're thinking, well, there's problems with X, Y, Z. Now, if you as a permanent secretary don't have that conversation then saying, well, I'm sorry, but this is going to be a problem, you should, maybe think about this, then there may, one might think, be problems in terms of implementation early in government. The difficulty is obviously at that time the Permanent Secretary is also trying to build a potential relationship, or a potential relationship would be very important to the working of the government. So managing that dividing line is quite tricky. However, Permanent Secretaries we spoke to all talked about how, in effect, that is what their job is about. That is why they are trusted as the most senior position in the civil service. It's what they have to do anyway when they're appearing in front of select committees in terms of, managing to know what the dividing line is between, advice about disclosing confidential government plans, the incumbent government, and about hearing and listening and pushing back. But nonetheless, this difficulty about implementation was an issue that we found. So one of the recommendations that we were most keen to stress in our report was firstly that the guidance should be expanded to include the expectation that implementation issues will be discussed. Now, that's difficult in as much as this can't be a policy costing resource. It would be a massive expansion if detailed working up of the implementation implications were included in this. But if it's not an expectation that that's going to be discussed from both sides, then the danger is that it maybe won't be discussed, that perhaps the desire to build a good relationship and to be seen as a civil service as able to enact the policies, whatever they might be, which is very important as well, can come too high. But, as I say, ultimately, I'm conscious of time, this good governance is at the heart of what these pre-election contacts are about. It was at the heart of them when they were first set up, and it's still the reason why we continue to do them today in all of their ambiguity and so forth. And so that's why both sides need to be very clear, not just what's the proprietary of these, what are the limits of them. They can't solve everything. You can only prepare so much for an election. However, if both sides are expecting that they will be, covering all of these issues and that they are really important for those early days of whatever government is returned next time round, then they can be used in the way that they ought to be and in the way that we think will make for a better and more effective government next time round.
Thanks very much indeed, Kath, on that. Again, there's a lot more which will develop over the next 12 months on how that works out. Now, John, how did you manage to secure safe space between the coalition parties pre-2007? How does it look from the Edinburgh experience?
Okay, thank you, Peter. I should probably start with a point of fairness, because the experience in Scotland that Akash has drawn on is experience drawn from the second coalition in Scotland. So it benefited from the experience of having run round the track twice, rather than being the product of the first go at the unfamiliar experience of coalition government. There were various political reasons why there was less demand for it at the first election. Essentially, no one was in any doubt about the outcome of the first election, and this all felt less pressing for the political parties. The opportunity to do it probably had three drivers. One, there was a strong sense, I think, across all the political parties that the electorate would not accept the proposition that their governing parties could take time off from government to prepare for an election. They didn't think that their ministers were entitled to the equivalent of preparation time for teachers. They expected their ministers to be in the classroom for the full 4 years, delivering the job, and therefore ministers were conscious that they needed a solution here, which was consistent with that. Second, the disciplines around the sharing of information between the parties in the coalition were very, very strong. I can only recall one instance in which a cabinet minister tried to withhold from the other party advice which they'd sought from civil servants, and we stamped on that with a considerable amount of vigour. So the ministers from both parties took it as given that if advice was sought from civil servants, that advice would be fully shared, and therefore, if they wanted the benefits of confidentiality, it was clear to them that simply working in the normal relationships could not be the foundation of that. And the third thing is that we and they had learnt from the second coalition forming process in 2003, that the presence of ill-considered propositions in manifestos is a very considerable nuisance to everybody when it comes to the process of coalition forming. And therefore, people who are looking beyond an election to the process of coalition forming that might take place want to be very, very sure that what goes into the manifesto will constitute the building blocks of a coalition agreement. So those were, in a sense, the shaping forces, and I think they lead to a couple of important points about the fact that finding a solution to this is more, in a sense, for the benefit of citizens, more for the benefit of the legitimate interests of citizens in good government than it is a process of doing a favour to political parties, because finding a set of practical solutions does enable government to continue as normal right up until the beginning of the election campaign, and it does give citizens the prospect of better considered propositions. But the third factor, and it relates in a sense to the conjunction of Akash and Kath's work, is that it had also become obvious to the political parties in government that unless we had a solution to this, they were going to be at a disadvantage to the opposition parties, in that the opposition parties had 6 months of guaranteed confidentiality in discussion with the civil service, and they didn't. And therefore, they articulated the desire to find a set of arrangements in which they could have absolute trust in the confidentiality of the discussions which took place. Once one started from those positions, the working out of the mechanics and negotiating of the mechanics took 2 or 3 months, but that's not fundamentally the difficult bit. Yeah, the difficult bit is making sure that everybody wants the process to fulfil certain criteria. Once we had that, then we designed process, and once you get into it, trust between ministers and the civil service becomes, in a sense, the crucial thing that one's trying to safeguard here. This is not an ad hominem point about me, but the conclusion we came to was that trust was strongest between cabinet ministers and their cabinet secretary, and therefore designing the process so that control of the confidentiality ran through the cabinet secretary's office was the best guarantor of preserving trust that we could find. So when you look at the processes, they may look a bit centralised. The requests were fed out through my office, and the advice was gathered back in through my office and passed to the respective party leaders, who could pass it to whoever in their teams they chose. And that might look unnecessary, but the point was to preserve the most convincing answer to the question, where is trust greatest And in our set of arrangements, the answer to that question was trust is greatest between the two party leaders and their cabinet secretary, who are working in a relationship of mutual trust all of the time. The more detailed mechanics are better set out in Akash's report than you will get from an off-the-cuff account from me just now. I think it's the dynamics rather than the specifics that matter here.
Thanks very much indeed, John. Lots of very interesting issues there, not least, of course, the different structure of government which you were working towards in Scotland at the time, going through the centre rather than the federal structure, and rather an important one in that respect. We'll come back to that later. Alex.
Thanks. So I want to pick up a few of the points that have been raised on both reports, although I was obviously primarily involved talking to Catherine about the second report. The first thing is one of the examples of advice on opposition policies that sort of tends to be forgotten nowadays, Jill Rutter will remember well, was the costings of opposition policies done by the government in 1987, certainly. I think 1983, though I wasn't around, where ministers deliberately set assumptions and the civil service produced costings of opposition policies, which were, enormous and were published by the government as a scare. This is what Labour would cost you. That's, I think one of the lessons from that is that actually doing costings is incredibly sensitive to the assumptions you make and who makes the assumptions. And so I think that's picking up the final point in Akash's report is right to be cautious. 2015 is going to be different. One of the issues in the past elections has been sometimes there was a strong expectation of a change of government in 1997 and indeed pretty much in 2010. And then in other years, in 2001 and 2005, you had the expectation that the government would be returned and the whole process was much more perfunctory in some ways. And the civil service, of course, is very alive to what the expectations are. And it's pretty clear that, the expectations are all over the place for 2015. And so the planning is going to have to be done for every scenario. One of my concerns, it's not really relevant, I suppose, to the particular reports, is that one of the things that's going to happen this time round, based on what happened after the 2010 election, is that all the parties are going to be pressed hugely in the run-up to the election on which bits of their manifesto are non-negotiable. And there's going to be huge pressure to say that every element this is non-negotiable, that's non-negotiable, because if you are ambiguous about it, people will say, oh, well, it's not worth the paper it's written on. And so I think that may make any negotiations about coalitions after the election much harder. Picking up the concerns in Akash's report about, in the next year, will government grind to a halt and will there be paralysis? I must say that isn't something that worries me. It seems to me that's a concern that is focused on the idea that government is all about forever announcing new policies, as opposed to actually getting on with doing the things they've already announced. And so I wouldn't be concerned about that issue of paralysis. I agree that we do need a process for the Liberal Democrats in particular, and indeed, obviously, for the Conservatives in departments where there's a Liberal Democrat Secretary of State. But, one of the interesting things, based on past experiences, is that even governing parties in the past have been quite resistant to sharing manifesto ideas with civil servants. It's true that in any election, you always find the civil servants pore over the manifesto of the governing party when it's published and finds things that take it by surprise, hadn't been aired with them. And so, I don't know that, I think there'll be limits on quite how much either of the coalition partners will want detailed civil service advice on what they're going to put in their manifestos. In terms of the consultations with the opposition, first of all, I very much agree with Kath that implementation, actually has to be part of the of the discussions. I mean, one thing for a start, it would be very unfair if the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats are having discussions where they're obviously able to discuss implementation issues, and you're not allowed to discuss implementation issues with the Labour Party. And in any case, as Kath says, the discussions that have taken place in the past have almost inevitably strayed into implementation issues, though, I mean, to some extent that has depended on personalities, which I think is a significant factor. I mean, some shadow ministers are much less confident, some shadow ministers are just suspicious of the civil service. In some cases, relationships, they don't hit it off with the permanent secretary. And so I think the nature of the discussions with the opposition is always going to be fairly variable. And there is a dilemma for officials, permanent secretaries in particular, when you're discussing issues about implementation with a shadow minister, because, I mean, this is exactly the same as what happens when there is a change of government, new ministers come in and are talking to the permanent secretary about implementing the plans in their manifesto. There is a real tension between a desire to say, yes, of course we can do what you want, and yes, we will go away and work out how we do it, and warning people that, well, we don't think we can do it, which inevitably creates tension. So I think the discussions on implementation with the opposition are something that rightly takes place, but again, we shouldn't necessarily expect too much of them. On the timing of the consultations, I think I disagree slightly with the Institute for Government on this one, where, I mean, I'm much less fussed by the timetable being put back to starting in October. Our experience in 2010, when they started in January 2009 in principle, was that there were initial contacts in the sort of first part of 2009, and then the process just sort of stalled and there wasn't much to do, and then it all picked up again as you got closer to the election. And I think that, that there's quite a lot that can be done in the 6 months that have been allowed now. And I mean, I was interested in the comment on the Scottish experience, that there was one comment about setting up the safe space being done too close to the election, after some of the manifesto ideas had been established. Well, that's quite tricky, because that does imply that part of the consultation is about, is more overtly about influencing the manifesto policies, which I think does raise questions. The role of the Cabinet Office, which is discussed in Kath's reports quite a lot. I mean, I think that inevitably there are differing views. There were some of the people Kath talked to wanted a much more central a much more central driving role for the Cabinet Office. Others were quite happy with the more slightly hands-off coordinating role that actually took place in 2010. And I must say I feel that's really where the process inevitably comes. I mean, departments want guidance on what's acceptable, what to do, but then, I think it's very much down to the individual departments how they handle it, with feedback to the centre. I mean, one of the things that was very useful in 2010 was we had informal permanent secretary discussions over a drink in the evening in Admiralty House, and that was an opportunity for people to express concerns and their feelings about things very openly. And that worked well. And we had a number of seminars with typically sort of heads of strategy units or whoever was responsible in departments. And again, they worked well. I mean, one of the things that I think was quite interesting out of that process was that we got the feedback from the individual departments about their discussions with shadow ministers. And in some cases, the permanent secretary expressed concern about the opposition policies and said, this is potentially very problematic. And are we sure that the leader of the opposition is fully signed up to what the Shadow Secretary of State wants to do? And so we did at times brief Gus to go when he was talking to David Cameron to check that what was being put forward by the shadow minister was indeed the Conservative Party policy, and you know, that was helpful clarification. I mean, I'm not going to go into the details of which ones that happened to. On Kath's point about resources, I mean, I think it's inevitable that the resources devoted to this are never going to be huge. And I mean, I just end with one bugbear, that the area where departments really waste resources is preparing briefs for incoming ministers, which are inevitably ring binders full that never get read and is a complete waste of time.
Yeah, Alex, thank you very much indeed. I remember, I think when we were doing the first hour reports, that the one ring binder which was definitely unread, which you were totally involved with, Robin Butler, was for Tony Blair.
Tony Blair, yes.
And who clearly never, ever read it in any shape or form. So it'll be a wonderful but misleading resource for historians when it drawn it. Could I just make 2 points of what was said? One on the length of time. I mean, our view would be that 10 months. Partly because of I mean, I agree with you entirely, and indeed it's the point Kath makes in the report, is that the 209 time is far too long. I mean, it's quite clear from our own study, exactly the point you made, that you had an initial meeting, then nothing much happened during the summer, then it developed. Our sense of the advantage of starting in June was to have the getting to know you phase in June, and then the work really getting going. Partly because it isn't really 6 months, because our sense was last time that almost by February, things are beginning to wind down because the parties are involved much more in electioneering and just their own psyche and resources. So that's why, I mean, clearly the system will cope, it always coped, but it just truncates it a bit. It assumes that an awful lot can be done in the kind of 2 months before Christmas and in the 6 weeks afterwards. That was our argument on it. The other thing on costings, as in my journalistic career, as a consumer of costings, some of which were propagandised by the current chairman of the Treasury Committee, and others later on, when things turned around, by very prominent figures in the opposition who were then working as special advisors in the Treasury. There was one constant between the costings which the Tories were feeding out in the 80s and the ones Labour were feeding out in the 90s. They all came to 30 billion. There was inexorable logic. The 30 billion was a kind of credible scare number. Anything beyond that would have been regarded as ridiculous, and below that wasn't scary enough. Could I just pose to you first, Alex, and then to John before I open it up? The question which is running through all our discussion is ambiguity versus clearer guidelines, because we sense there's a clear liking for ambiguity. It avoids awkward choices, particularly with the coalition. And the battle between clarity and ambiguity is an unresolved one, and this is what is the underlying worry behind the Akash and Robin's analysis. Alex?
Well, I think that some ambiguity is probably a necessary part of the process, but equally there are, when areas where there is a lack of clarity and that causes people to be particularly uncomfortable or to, in some cases do silly things, then you need to do that. And I think the areas where ambiguity could be reduced is, first of all, the point about can you discuss implementation with the opposition? I mean, that does seem to me. And secondly, that setting up some sort of process for dealing with Liberal Democrats in departments headed by a Secretary of State who's Conservative and vice versa. Where I think there needs to be some clarity about what the process should be.
And there's of course an additional one, which is arm's length bodies.
Yeah. Now, well, arm's length bodies are, were always a nightmare. I mean, because most departments have very little control over their contacts with the opposition, and sometimes you find arm's length bodies have briefed the opposition on ways that are totally counter to what you would have wanted. But there's some scope for departments trying to be a bit more controlling, but some arms length bodies are incredibly independent and won't take kindly to being told. Especially
those which have got very prominent figures as their chair. John, ambiguity versus clarity of guidelines.
I suppose my starting point is that ambiguity is not much of a friend of trust. suspicion creeps into the gaps that ambiguity creates. And in a world where the clear expectation is that another coalition will be an outcome, and although we turned out to be wrong, those were our expectations in Scotland, protecting the sense of even-handedness between parties is crucial to the whole success of coalition government as a concept. It's not a day one thing, or it's not it's not the last day of the 5 years thing. Once you start to lose the party's belief that the civil service is being even-handed in its support, you've started to erode something which is fundamental to the success of coalition government. And of course you can't entirely eradicate different degrees of energy and zeal with which people respond to requests for advice. But it's also important to remember that that people may change chairs in this process. So one doesn't want to go into an election with the members of a coalition government thinking that perhaps particular civil servants were just a bit over-friendly to a particular cabinet minister in the way they provided advice. If on the other side of the election the chairs are going to be reversed and you're going to ask a minister from another party to have full trust in the civil servants who previously were supporting a minister from another party. It's the same issue in a sense as in transitions from between parties in single party government, except that the spectators are closer to the action, and the risk of misinterpretation, of suspicion arising, is that much greater. Can I just take a moment to make one point? Alex's very interesting thoughts stimulated me to think about the difference between manifestos when you get into government and coalition agreements when you get into government. Manifestos are kind of loose plans which you can go on discussing, a bit of reshaping, perhaps not quite this, how about that. Coalition agreements are more in the nature of a contract between the two parties, or at least they're certainly seen that way by the smaller party. And therefore the precise terms matter more than the precise wording of a manifesto does. And it does seem to me that if one expects coalitions, then one does go a bit beyond what it's sensible to do if one's expecting a single party to be in control of a manifesto.
Yeah, very interesting distinction there. Now let's open it up to questions. Could you say who you are? I know who a lot of you are, and we'll take two or three together because we've got some amount of time. There's some in the Robert. Why don't you start off and then this?
Robert Hazel, fellow here at the Institute, who did some work on these issues with Akash and Kath before 2010. My question is about a level playing field, and how level do you think we can get the playing field between the parties in government and the opposition party? So I'm really seeking a bit more joining up between Akash's paper and presentation and Kath's. And I'm still not quite clear whether you don't think it's desirable for the opposition party to have access to civil service advice about implementation, etc., on the same basis as the governing parties, or whether you think, yes, in principle it's desirable, but it's just not feasible. Putting it another way, in terms of John Elvidge's safe space, can we construct the same safe space that the opposition parties would use as the governing parties, or again, is that not feasible?
Everything is wonderfully joined up between the two reports, I can assure you.
Thank you. Caroline Slowcock from Civil Exchange. I'm slightly worried that what you're talking about really is fine-tuning of the existing system, whereas really there's an opportunity to be a bit more radical than that. I think it is a system, in my view, which is rather broken, and having worked in government and seen how it actually works, there's clearly a very unlevel playing field, as the previous speaker was suggesting. And it's not just the costings of individual policies which is the issue here. And this is something which tends to happen relatively late in the day. When, for example, the opposition or possibly the incoming government tries to get some costing of its policies. It's also about an understanding of the real issues and challenges and drivers of the economy, and the things which the underlying environment in which government enters. And with a coalition government, obviously there's a need to work out agreements about how different parties are treated. But we also have a fixed term parliament, and that gives us relative certainty about that final year. And I'd like to see that final year used far more constructively. And there is a model, I think it's Netherlands, where they do have some much more planned discussions where they put information into the environment for everybody, not just the parties, but also the electorate. In our country, the Office for Budget Responsibility could, for example, be producing a report about the long-term challenges, the long-term drivers of public expenditure.
It does, every year.
Well, it does, the fiscal sustainability report, but it could update that in the context of the next 5 years and the challenges there. And that could provide a platform for public and political debate, which would get beyond just the costings of individual policies, but would actually put everybody, the electorate as well as the politicians, onto a level playing field. And I wonder what you think about that idea.
Okay. Andrew. A participant in every sense.
Andrew Stunnell, Liberal Democrat MP who took part in the coalition negotiations. It's been fascinating to hear the contributions. There are two separate sets of questions, actually. The parties before the election and then coalition partners after the election. And I could easily contribute to both of those discussions one way and the other. But I just wanted to make the point that I think in some ways these two reports are fighting the last war. Before the last election, it was generally presumed that coalitions wouldn't work. Since the last election, it's been presumed that two-party coalitions are going to be the norm. Actually, there were negotiations which would have led to a 3- or 4-party coalition, possibly not with everybody in ministerial roles. And that brings me to the point about the role of the civil service in only being answerable to the Prime Minister and not, in fact, answerable to Parliament. So there's a really complicated situation, could easily have arisen in 2010, which you haven't discussed. What if the SNP and PC and the Liberal Democrats and Labour had been able to form a minority, well, it wouldn't have been a minority administration, a few more seats. So I just think that it's a very interesting discussion, but you may not be prepared for the next election when you've concluded it.
Okay. Before I bring people in, we are going to be doing some work, which Akash will be doing, on the lessons of the coalition, which will cover exactly that point, Andrew. But that will come in a later report about what happened, the lessons of the, and I'm sure Akash will be talking to you on exactly that point on the lessons of negotiations and the options for there. But we were very much not addressing that in these reports now, but fully recognising that's a big issue. But we thought, given we've got 12 months to go, we'd do that one a bit later on that score. Can I just make a general point, and I'll bring Akash in. We are some way ahead in calling for transparency and everything else than I think some opinion in Whitehall is. Both Caroline and I gave evidence, and Akash did, to Graham Allen's committee, which produced a very interesting report this morning. I think we are keen to have some impact, while recognising some of our suggestions are more likely to occur after the election. I think some of these suggestions you're making, I rather agree with, but I don't see any appetite for at all, which is why at the end of Akash's report there is some discussion of what we'd ideally like to see. But why don't you talk about the Netherlands, Akash?
Yeah, sure.
Or any other points, and I'll bring Catherine in.
Yeah, sure. I was going to mention that. Yes, I was in The Hague a couple of months ago, actually looking at some of the elements of the pre-election planning that they do there. So I'll come on to that in a sec. I mean, just to pick up on Robert's question first, and in a way, actually, all three questions were related. I mean, how level can and should the playing field be between parties of government and of opposition. I mean, I think through the reports and through the project as a whole, I mean, we were steering between thinking about, you know, if you're designing the system from scratch, how would it ideally work, and trying to put out there some practical recommendations for now, things that might actually be workable between, you know, over the coming months. And we are well aware of a lack of appetite for radical change of the kind we might have recommended. For example, the type of systems they have in the Netherlands, but even going as far as saying, yes, there should be a single integrated separate space system, as it was termed in Scotland, with a pretty much equivalent offer made to the four main parties. I mean, even that would be something of a leap for Whitehall, and I think, I mean, from Kath's research and Alex's comments, you know, one senses that would be quite a departure. I mean, in principle, I think there is quite a good case, particularly for the reasons John was setting out, and actually as Caroline Slocum was mentioning, if we're in an era of more frequent coalition governments, I think there is a strong case actually for, yes, thinking about designing an integrated system with support, provision of information analysis and data and so on to inform policy development across the spectrum. And we do talk about that in the paper, and I hope that's something we'll return to probably towards and after the election, when we kind of look back on how it all worked. I will just, I mean, I won't go into detail about all of these systems, but I mean, as far as the Netherlands is concerned, I mean, yes, what's fascinating about that system, of course, they know as a matter of absolute certainty there will be coalition negotiations after the election between any number of possible, sometimes rather bizarre political combinations. And so the system that we have actually studied, there's a little bit in this report, and there is due to be a separate standalone paper published on this over the next few weeks, hopefully. What they do is, yeah, there's the system of manifesto analysis provided to all parties. Scorecards are published on costs and economic and social and environmental impacts of all parties' manifesto policies. There's very much a sense there that you want all parties working off a shared evidence base, shared set of data, shared set of assumptions about how different policies will interact and so on. And then that very much is seen as the way to pave the way to smooth coalition formation negotiations after the election, which again the civil service and the independent Central Planning Bureau, which does a lot of the analysis, are then very much involved in. So yes, it's an entirely different, hugely different system to what we have here for all sorts of reasons. It has a lot to recommend actually. Obviously there's no way we would leap to such a different system, but I do believe if we're in a period of multi-party politics over the longer term, movement down that path would be advisable, certainly.
John?
Yeah, two things really. One, to pick up from the Netherlands, because as it happens, been doing some work over the last few weeks with a former permanent secretary from the Netherlands in Finland about how the Finns might evolve their more radical approach to the role the civil service plays in the last year of fixed-term parliaments, again in a country that knows that coalition will follow coalition. And their practice is slightly different. The civil service publishes its analysis of the challenges of the next 5 years. And not a set of recommendations about what one should do, but an analysis of what issues will have to be grappled with in one way or another, and it makes that available publicly on equal terms, not just to the political parties but to civic societies, so that people can engage with the political parties from their own perspective. So there's absolutely no doubt that there is more radical space to be jumped into. Personally, I share the view that Whitehall's appetite for jumping is not sufficiently great to make that a practical issue at the moment. The other thing is, we do, again, it's one of these kind of parallel topics. We do have some experience of the way in which the civil service works with a range of parties in these circumstances. We evolved a whole other set of practices about how the civil service relates, particularly to very small parties in complex negotiations about coalition forming and in a sense creating the circumstances in which a coalition can come into being, even if those parties are not themselves going to be members of the coalition. So there is other territory there to be explored. I agree, but again, Westminster in 2014 doesn't feel like the place where people are falling over themselves to explore those issues.
Yes, it's certainly not St. Petersburg, 1917. No, I think, just bring the two, just one point. I think that when Andrew said about coalition proving itself, I still think there's a mood in Whitehall and Westminster to say, is this still an aberration? I still think that's one of the guarding things. However much we would say, actually, the system's adopted in practical terms quite well, but there's still that psychological also. Catherine and Alex.
Yeah, I mean, all three questions can be sort of taken together really about, could we go further in thinking about this? And certainly we have thought further, much further. But the issue we came up with when, thinking about these reports and thinking about what we wanted to look at was, before this last year, was making sure that we had gone over these issues as they will actually likely unfold, and to make sure that the issues as they are likely to happen and the solutions that are going to sort of be developed for them are better. So yes, the reports are a sort of case of not letting the best be the enemy of the good, but getting that good to be a lot better is still really important. And I completely agree with you in terms of not fighting the last war. It's something that Peter and I found as we looked back at how civil service and political parties prepared before each election is there was always this danger of preparing yourself for what had gone wrong the last time round. And in our talks, last time talking to parts of the civil service, talking to political parties about what we had learned, it sounds sort of simplistic and a cliche, but going around to them and saying to them, look, expect the unexpected. Something's going to be completely different from what you're used to last time round. You can only prepare so much. Alex talked about the sort of need to do scenario planning for different things. There is a real danger this time round that the civil service will try and prepare for every eventuality that they can conceive. And then again, something, very different is going to be the thing that then you have to adjust. So that you need to sort of, again, it sounds a bit ridiculous in a way, but you need to prepare yourselves for what you haven't prepared for, in a sense. And that's very difficult to do, but learning from all of these past examples, thinking about what you're actually doing and thinking about how it can be sort of honed and improved and how it can actually meet the sort of the expectations, the requirements that are upon you for governments is really, really important. And in terms of this issue about what it is, the broader issue that we're talking about here, it's, how better policy making by the parties can then be translated into government. It's something we come up against again and again in terms of civil service reform, in terms of political party activity, and all sorts of the things that the Institute for Government calls. And the civil service is not the only solution to that. We found talking to politicians and civil servants about the pre-election contacts, they had quite differing expectations from them. As people have touched upon, for many of the parties, they don't want necessarily that engagement in manifesto policy preparation. So there's something there as well about changing culture expectations, the kind of work that is done in terms of policy making within the parties, and we've looked a bit at various aspects of that isn't just about the role of the civil service. But we also, across a lot of the Institute's work, we talk about the need for a better conception of the civil service as a guardianship role, not just serving the government of the day, that, you know, throughout their history, this idea of a permanent and impartial part of government, serving the government of the day, but also with that broader constitutional role, is very important. It's just, for us, in the case of these reports, it was about how do you actually turn that into practice for these short-term issues, and hopefully raising some of these longer-term issues, which certainly we want to come back to. We shouldn't just be talking about these in the run-up to election. We should be talking about them over the longer term.
Alex?
Well, first of all, I agree with Kath very much about expect the unexpected. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. Picking up Andrew's point, I mean, one thing about the coalition negotiations in 2010 was they didn't involve the civil service. I mean, the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives chose basically to have the four on each side in the room together, and occasionally asking questions of all the civil servants who were prepared to provide advice, but by and large doing it themselves. I mean, obviously the subsequent longer coalition document had some civil service input. So, I mean, I think, you know, there are going to be, I mean, who knows what will happen after the next election, but, you know, one of the things to prepare for is, you know, not big civil service involvement in the actual negotiations. And the other point on the sort of radical steps, yes, of course there are, you know, a much more radical options that could be pursued, but I don't think it's just Whitehall that's not ready to take the jump. I think it's the political parties as well. I don't sense that the political parties are ready to accept some independent arbiter saying this is the implication of your policies, that they then have to sort of say yes, of course. I think that's a big step for them as well as Whitehall.
Right. Here and there, yeah. And sorry, and so gentleman there, yeah.
Simon Judge, Department for Education. So rather prosaic, practical question for John, following up your comments on trust. You talk quite a bit, I think, about the risk of conspiracy, or sort of perceived conspiracy. The other risk that slightly concerns me is just a straightforward cock-up. So, you know, a minister asks you about an issue and you say, oh, that's very interesting, I did a note for so-and-so last week about that, and then you realise halfway through the conversation that that was a protected conversation. I just wondered if you had that risk at all in 2007, and how you helped people to avoid putting their foot in it.
Yes, the cock-up is always absolutely essential to our work here at the IFG, and we build it into all our analysis. Gentleman there, and then over here.
Andrew Goodman. So I'm quite interested between the contrast between John and Alex's points around centralisation of information flow. So even if you have a kind of return scenario, you're likely to not have the same ministers in post. And if you have the opposition winning election, you're likely that many of the shadows won't remain in those ministerial posts. And so if, as seems likely, we go for a much more departmental flow of information from permanent secretary to shadow, I'm kind of intrigued to see, and if you guys have kind of thoughts on how you institutionalise that at the party level and make sure either the trust is built or the information flows, because it seems easier to do that in a centralised flow, as in Scotland, but it also seems that doesn't build some of the relationships and some of the confidentiality you might want to.
Absolutely. And gentleman there.
David Rogers from Deloitte. I was wondering if you could say whether you've given any consideration to the role of the Freedom of Information Act, particularly where civil servants are involved in discussion either with opposition parties or as part of coalition negotiations. I guess the first question a politician would want to ask is, will any of this become public ever? And the civil servant's response would probably be, I imagine, that depends. Would that constrain discussions at all?
Yeah, that's three very, very interesting questions. If I might just comment before turning it over on the second one, one of the things that Kath and I found in our work was precisely, I mean, those tensions between central and departmental. I mean, Alex expressed our coordination, and that was what he did last time for the last lecture was very important. But it wasn't just creation of coalition, it was, we give an example of where a shadow's thinking goes beyond what's the manifesto. And the example was the Home Office, and this is all on the record in our report. That Chris Grayling was the Shadow Home Secretary, in his discussions with the then Permanent Secretary of the Home Office, set out some of his thoughts, which went further. he doesn't get appointed Home Secretary, gets appointed outside the Cabinet at that stage. Theresa May, who had no background in Home Affairs, moves in. You had the paradox that the permanent Secretary of the Home Office and the senior official at the Home Office knew far, far more about what the thinking of the Tory opposition was, and indeed the additional thinking, which hadn't been written down, than the incoming Home Secretary did. And indeed, the second-tier Home Secretary people, who'd been doing quite big jobs, say doing immigration or policing, at Shadowham came into post. They knew more about it. And that underlined one of the problems was of failure to information share among shadows. And one of the messages we've been conveying in our present work with the political parties is you've got to talk to each other too. So on those 3 points, cock up, which I'm sure never happened in Edinburgh.
Well, I always think it's wise to allow for cock up, but in a sense the first 2 questions are related because the centralisation was the safeguard mechanism against cock up. Individual heads of department did not get to hand their advice direct to a minister or that minister's special advisors. The question came into the centre and provided the opportunity to say to the party leaders, is this a question you want answered from your party perspective? And then then the civil servants' advice came back through the centre. So if someone had inadvertently included stuff they hadn't. Now, that doesn't, of course, give you 100% safeguard that people one day forget that a piece of advice they gave was in one context and not another, and that they blurt it out. I guess you just have to say sometimes, sheer dumb luck has to play a part, and it didn't happen. But of course, you can't. No system's perfect. You can't. You can't guarantee that will be so. Freedom of information is interesting, particularly in a Scottish context, because the ministerial overrides in Scottish freedom of information legislation are weaker than the ministerial powers in UK freedom of information legislation. So the risk is greater. I think all one can say is that in 2007 the erosion of the confidentiality of advice to ministers had not progressed as far as it now has, and ministers worked on the assumption that what was clearly private policy advice would stay private. Whether they would make that assumption now is a harder question to judge.
Kath,
Yeah, I mean, on FOI, it is something that we considered. Doesn't appear in the report, but we were thinking through that. And in terms of the pre-election context, it's slightly different in terms of preparing policy advice. But in terms of the pre-election context, the only product for it last time round was notes on what the meetings had been and how they'd gone that were shared with the Cabinet Office. If it did become FOIable, and I don't think it's been tested, so we don't know, then they will just not do that, so there would just be no written record for it, is my assumption. But I think that would be detrimental to it. As far as I can tell from what we know of the FOI Act, is it should be covered by privileged political information, but we don't know. But I don't think it would be, like I say, it would be detrimental to them. A different issue, but a related one that some of this touches upon is the precedent or the convention around what happens to the papers of a previous administration in the event of change of government. Because the current policy is that a new government will not have access to the papers of a previous administration. So it's one of the big routines that happen in and around election day, which is a note goes around and can you all make sure you pass your papers on and so forth. And so the next government will not be able to access exactly the same sort of policy advice and papers and so forth and see that privileged information. Now, what happens if you have, say, Labour, Liberal Democrats coalition next time round? Do the Liberal Democrats get access to those papers but the Labour ministers don't? Do the Liberal Democrats then not get access to the same papers they were using last time round because, in theory it was a different government? It's a very tricky one and there's no right answer to that. So how that's resolved, should it occur, is another sort of big question.
Yeah, I mean, the Constitution Committee of the Lords produced an answer to it, which struck me as creating wonderful problems for your successors in the Cabinet Office, Alex. Alex, do you want to come in on that?
Just on freedom of information, I mean, John's point about the ministerial override protections in the UK being greater. I mean, this is, of course, still now going to the Supreme Court following the Prince Charles letter case. So it's, I mean, we'll have to see how strong the UK protections are. On Andrew's point about the ministers and shadows and new people appearing, not the people you'd had the contacts with, I mean, I think that's just an inevitable part of our system. And because leaders of the opposition or prime ministers or leaders of minority parties in coalitions are not ever willing to admit that the people in post are not going to be reappointed, even if everybody assumes it. There's no way you can get privileged advance information on that.
No, I mean, I think the only thing on that we felt was the need for the opposition to share information on their side. And because I think it's a perennial problem. I mean, I think if one goes, the Whitehall department is siloed, certainly our experience is shadow teams are even more siloed. And the pull of the centre is so much weaker, I mean, to an extraordinary extent in some respects. Akash?
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, on this question about, is there a risk of things being accidentally revealed or passed on to the other side when that wasn't supposed to be the terms on which things were done? I mean, that was the kind of concern we heard from a number of people we spoke to, and I think that really does reinforce the case for clarity and, as was designed in Scotland, a separate procedure. And if something is being done for one party only, for that side's eyes only, it should be labelled as such and through whatever particular mechanism and handled differently. I mean, in Scotland, yes, it all went through the very centre of government. We went back and forth a bit on this issue, how you might implement this in Whitehall. I'm sure there'll be different views, but we felt it was probably not workable on the bigger scale of Whitehall for everything to be routed via the Cabinet Office, but that it was probably it would need to all go through the Permanent Secretary's office at the departmental level with close coordination and sharing of information with the centre as well. The only other point I was going to make on that question of how much central coordination you could and should have, I mean, I think it partly does come back to what you're designing the system to achieve. I mean, in terms of the pre-election contacts in their sort of original, relatively narrow model, if it is primarily about a department being ready to make machinery of government changes for a new government based on agreed party policy, then you can probably do that largely at a departmental level. But the more you get into saying, as we are advocating, you should be having this two-way dialogue, thinking about how actually, yes, you can help parties improve their plans and make them more implementable. Lots of big policy plans, of course, are cross-cutting and so on. So you do need to think more about the central coordination of all that.
Good. Well, I think we ought to draw it to a close now. Been a fascinating discussion, and indeed it opens up lots of issues over the next year, which the Institute will be coming back to in various ways. As I mentioned earlier, Akash will be doing some work on lessons of the coalition creation and drawing up some of the questions Andrew Stunnell rightly raised, and we're going to be doing that towards the end of the year, and we'll be coming back to many of the issues of the pre-election contacts as they go away, as they get underway, and so on. And could I, on your behalf, thank enormously John Elvidge, Alex Allan, Akash Paun and Catherine Haddon for their contributions to what's been an absolutely fascinating discussion on what's going to be a very sensitive period over the next year. So thank you very much indeed.